Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I'm your host, Shane Phillips. Every 2 weeks, we discuss a different housing research paper, translating it into non-academic language to better understand how we can create more affordable and more accessible and equitable cities. Mike Manville is my co-host, and our guest today is Professor Jake Wegmann of the University of Texas at Austin. This week, we're talking about vacant housing, a topic that probably needs little introduction. You've seen vacant houses blamed for the housing crisis, you've heard we can solve homelessness by reoccupying them, and you may have heard rumblings about the need for a vacancy tax to stop them. Jake's paper is one of the first to take a really evidence-driven look at the scale and distribution of a specific kind of vacant house, what he calls ghost dwellings, and we think it provides really important context that we're going to need if we're going to talk about this subject constructively. We always ask our guests to give us a tour of their city, but this time, due to some audio problems, we had to cut it from our recording. Jake took us to two places, though, one in Austin and another in his hometown of Edmonton, Alberta. In Austin, he recommends Taco Mile, which I think speaks for itself. We also included an article about it in our show notes. And in Edmonton, on the University of Alberta campus, he suggested Hub Mall, which he described as a skyscraper turned on its side, or like a European walking street, but with a roof over it, which makes sense given the weather up there. The mall, as he says, embodies a spirit of experimentation that we seem to have lost and that he wishes, and that I wish, we could bring back again. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and you can contact me with questions or research paper ideas at shanephillips@ucla.edu. Or you can reach me at Twitter at Shane D. Phillips. Here's Professor Jake Wegmann. With us this time is Jake Wegmann, Associate Professor in the Community and Regional Planning Program at the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture, and we're talking with him about housing vacancies, a topic that I myself have written about for the Lewis Center, and that many of our listeners are probably familiar with as a controversial topic in housing policy debates. Jake, we are glad to have you here to shed some light on the subject. Welcome to the Housing Voice podcast.
Thanks for having me on. I'm a regular listener, so it's a lot of fun to be on the other side here.
And co-hosting with me this time on our rotating schedule is Professor Mike Manville. Hey, Mike.
Hey, guys.
So your paper was published in the Journal of Urban Affairs in 2019, and it's titled Residences Without Residents: Assessing the Geography of Ghost Dwellings in Big U.S. Cities. And it's really foundational research about the nature of housing vacancies in the U.S., particularly in high-cost housing markets, the kind of basic facts and context that are often missing, I think, in conversations about vacancies. And it's focused on a specific kind of vacant housing. And this is vacation homes, second or third homes, pieds à terre, which I love saying, and other vacancies that all fall under the header of what you call ghost dwellings. So an interesting thing about these ghost dwellings is that the familiar paradigm seems to have kind of reversed, with vacation homes now seeming to concentrate in cities rather than the country where we think of them traditionally. You write in the paper, although vacation dwellings are nothing new, what is arguably novel is that they are perceived to be appearing in increasing numbers within large cities, exactly the sorts of places that second home dwellers might once have been assumed to be retreating from in favor of a bucolic rural getaway. So let's start here. How do you define a ghost dwelling, and what makes it distinct from other kinds of housing vacancies?
I started with a definition that I had seen being used in some research on Israel, where researchers were using a term called ghost apartments. Mm-hmm. And so it's mostly the same thing as that, but I just tweaked it a little bit to be a ghost dwelling rather than a ghost apartment, because as you both know, the vast majority of housing units in the United States, including within large cities, are single family houses. So I didn't want to make it sound like these are only in apartments.
Right.
And so really just, my definition here was just a seasonally, recreationally, or occasionally used dwelling, to use the census's terminology, that's located in one of the 100 largest cities in the United States. Or excuse me, the 50 largest cities in the United States.
Okay, and how is that distinct from these other kinds of vacancies?
So that is very different, for example, from a housing unit located in a large city that's vacant because, it's in the middle of being rented,
Hmm.
or it has just been completed, or someone is living there but or just moved out and is trying to sell it. It's also very different from the kind of vacancy which, rightly gets a lot of attention, which is long-term vacancy or abandonment that
Yeah.
we might expect to see, and particularly in Rust Belt situations, but really that exists all over the country. Or even in a hot market city, you might see a housing unit that is in some sort of a speculative freeze, and the property owner is, waiting for the right buyer to come along and just is keeping it vacant.
Hmm.
So a ghost dwelling wouldn't intersect with any of those other types of vacancy.
Got it. And so why are we thinking that these are what's the concern with them? Like what harm are these doing or potentially doing?
Well, I think when I started this paper, part of my motivation was I wanted to see, is this really, first of all, is this actually increasing like people say that it is,
Hmm.
or seem to think that it is? I think it is very symbolically potent, and I'd say the ultimate visual representation of this is probably, think of the super tall skyscrapers, right next to
Yeah. Yeah.
Manhattan. And sort of the paradigmatic image that someone would have would be maybe a Russian oligarch who is buying an enormous, condo in one of these super tall buildings, and is, owning it through multiple layers of shell entities, so that you can't trace back their ownership, and might be using it to stash their money away. So I think there's often kind of a whiff of something nefarious with this sort of thing. But I think it's important to point out that there are much more prosaic examples too. And, we could walk through a couple of scenarios, just much more everyday things. But I think, to answer your question, what's the worry here? Some people are worried about a deadening of urban neighborhoods, that if you have a neighborhood with a lot of housing units that are mostly not being lived in most of the time, even if, the housing market is hot and, rents are high and housing prices are high, that at street level there just aren't many people walking around. Maybe the local shops and restaurants are withering because there aren't people to
Hmm.
support them. So I think that's one category of concerns. And then another category of concerns is that you have these people who kind of only live in a city part-time. And if there are enough of them, within a given area, then you begin to lose some sort of a character in that area. Maybe just in the same way that you would in neighborhoods that are flooded with tourism, right? Over
Hmm.
tourism has been a big topic of conversation, especially in Europe. But maybe you could get the same thing with these sorts of, housing arrangements, even if it's not actually people staying in hotels, but, maybe it's someone who's living in their pied a terre for, 3 weeks out of the year or something like that. You could have someone who's spending time there, but really isn't tied to the community in a meaningful way. And then I guess the last set of concerns I would, bring up would be people are worried that this is putting upward pressure on the housing market, or that this is,
Right.
eating away at scarce housing stock in a supply
Yeah.
city.
People are keeping a unit vacant that someone could be living in, and the person who would be living in that is now living in some other housing instead and taking up space, basically, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the paper, you note that the number of ghost dwellings is quite small, actually, but they're growing as a share of the overall housing stock. You analyzed ghost dwelling data for the 50 largest cities in the US, as you said, and you found that they made up 0.7% of the housing stock in the year 2000, then 0.9% in 2010, and by 2017, they'd shot up to 1.4%. So again, these aren't huge numbers, but a doubling in less than 20 years certainly warrants some attention, I think, and investigation. I think it also might help explain why vacancies have become of greater public interest over the last 5 years or so. It's often rates of change rather than absolute numbers that spur attention and controversy. And I think we've seen that actually with like immigration, for example.
That's right.
So we still know very little about how these kinds of vacancies vary city by city or metro area by metro area or between neighborhoods, building types, ownership structures, and so on. And if we don't know that, then it's going to be hard to know how to respond appropriately. So as I said, your paper is helping to build that foundation, and you started out by looking at these 50 largest cities. What stood out to you from that part of the analysis?
So in that part of the analysis, kind of like you were hinting at, Shane, I wanted to pay attention both to the rate of growth, but also the absolute number. And then the third thing that I looked at was just the share of the total housing stock. Mm-hmm. And so I ranked the 50 cities on the basis of those three things. And there were 5 cities that kind of were in the top 10 list for in all 3 criteria. And then there were 2 more that were on the 2 of the 3 top 10 lists. So the 5 ghost dwelling capitals of America, if you will, were Austin, Atlanta, Miami, Las Vegas, and New Orleans. And then San Francisco and New York were the 2 cities that were, appeared in the top 10 list twice. Just to say a little something about, that list of cities, San Francisco, New York, Las Vegas, Miami, I found entirely unsurprising. I was expecting them all to be on that list. New Orleans, I found a little bit more surprising, but, if you think about it in terms of, in particular, the effects that the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina may have had, where you've had a lot of damaged housing units that maybe a lot of local people couldn't afford to fix and bring back to life, but maybe a lot of outsiders who are drawn to the culture and the general vibe of the city might be. So that one made a little bit more sense to me once I thought about it. Austin and Atlanta, I found a little bit more surprising. They're both hot market, booming cities. I live in one of them. I live in Austin, and it's an exciting place to be. But I don't generally think of either one as, on anyone's list of global cities. And often when we think of ghost dwellings, we're thinking of this kind of global phenomenon. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a good reminder that there's a lot going on here, right? And in fact, one of the things I meant to mention earlier in the definitional part of our discussion was the Israeli researchers specifically defined ghost apartments as foreign-owned, mostly unoccupied dwellings. Yeah. And I, for obvious reasons,
only foreign people can be ghosts.
Yeah, and Israel is a very small country, and it's kind of like almost barely bigger than a very large metro area in the U.S. And in the U.S., it's I didn't think that criterion was relevant at all. So some of this could be globalization, but some of this could just be things that are happening inside of the U.S.
Yeah. I'm actually kind of curious about the Israel case because it almost doesn't make sense to have a vacant apartment. If you buy a condo, maybe you're banking on it appreciating over time, and so you're not really going to lose your money. Or if you're a Russian oligarch, maybe you don't really care about whether it appreciates and you're just trying to like launder your money out of the country or something. But with an apartment, it's like it exists to be rented out, and if you're not going to live in it anyway, you might as well just rent it and make some money as opposed to keep it empty, right? Like, what's the harm?
Yeah, there was a very specific context in one of the Israeli studies. I can't remember the names of the authors off the top of my head, but
we'll be sure to include the paper in our
I'll send along. But these apartments that were referenced in one of the studies, they were in Jerusalem, and they were specifically for people, Jewish people from the Jewish diaspora who wanted to travel to Jerusalem to attend certain, religious events. And that's really why they wanted those apartments.
Okay. And the other thing that came to mind was with New Orleans, I want to make sure we're distinguishing ghost dwellings from short-term rentals. Those are not the same thing, right? So I know that New Orleans has a lot of short-term rentals, and that's like kind of a problem in the city. But these are not, ghost dwellings don't fall under that category.
Well, so, to do this study, and I didn't really talk about this, but the reason I decided to do the study in the first place was because I was curious about the topic, but I just kind of thought, well, how do you study this? Where do you find data on this? And I was looking into, could I get utility data or, various things that the people have used. And then I realized that the census has this category of seasonal, recreational, and occasional occupancy, which weirdly enough, those letters are SRO, but it's, totally different SRO than what we would normally talk about. And I played around with the data, and I became convinced, I'm still open to it being challenged, but I think that this SRO this other kind of SRO maps pretty well onto ghost dwellings. It is possible there could be some overlap, perhaps, with units that get short-term rented out to some degree. But I've done other research on Airbnb rentals, and I found that the neighborhoods where that was at its peak, there was some overlap with the ghost dwelling hotspots, but the ghost dwelling hotspots were in a much more tended to be in a much more restricted set of neighborhoods than so I'm pretty convinced that seasonal, recreational, occasional occupancy, that is, largely picking up ghost dwellings. And maybe there are some units that flip back and forth. Maybe someone owns a unit in Manhattan that they use it as a pied-à-terre, and every so often they Airbnb it out, perhaps. So there's some overlap. But of course, a lot of Airbnb units, have someone living in them, some or all the time.
Right.
And so when the census,
whether you're renting a room versus the whole unit, that kind of thing. Yeah. And the last thing with like the entire city analysis I wanted to talk about briefly was Mesa, the city of Mesa, and how that's more of the traditional vacant home ghost dwelling scenario with snowbirds, your grandparents who go there during winter kind of thing. Can you tell us a little bit about that case and actually the trend of kind of shrinking ghost dwellings in those types of locations?
That was an interesting one that I wasn't expecting. But first of all, fun fact, Mesa is one of the 50 biggest cities in the United States, which, or at least it was as of the 2013 through 2017 ACS data when I looked at it. So it was part of my 50 cities. And then, it ranked first, according to one of my three criteria, was first in the percentage of the housing units within the city that are ghost dwellings, was 8%. But it was ranked dead last in the growth rate among the 50 cities. It was had negative growth. So ghost dwellings were shrinking as time was going by. So my read on that is 50, 60, 70 years ago, think of the era when Sun City developments were, really coming into their own. And, the phenomenon of snowbirds was really picking up in the post-war era. Mesa is probably one of the places that a lot of people, from the Frost Belt went to, and they probably have these seasonal migration patterns. And now that Mesa is a very large city, and as the Phoenix area grows like crazy, Mesa is probably transitioning to something quite different, and maybe more of the snowbird activity, I'm just imagining, is kind of increasingly found further away from the core of the metro. But that's my hypothesis for what's going on.
Yeah, and your point about how people are shifting toward maybe having these ghost dwellings in cities, and maybe for the amenities and so forth that are offered there, it sort of fits with the reduction in a place like Mesa that's more suburban. And one last thing I did want to note here, since we are UCLA, Los Angeles did not make the list of the top 7 in terms of ghost dwelling frequency and absolute number and everything. We're actually below average in terms of ghost dwellings in that list. So you said nationwide, we're about 1.4% of the total housing stock falls under this category. Los Angeles is about 0.9%. So about, 2/3. And that's also up from 0.4% in 2000. So it's also doubled, but from a lower base. So in terms of the data itself, you looked at a whole range of variables at the neighborhood level that includes a simple count of ghost dwellings, as well as things like changes in income, the non-Hispanic white share of the population, the share of the population age 65 or older, population density, and so on. You were trying to do some kind of loose testing of 6 common explanations or hypotheses for why ghost dwellings crop up in certain places. Could you quickly review what those hypotheses were and what kind of support you found, if any, for each of them?
So I scoured literature from around the United States and around the world, trying to see different ideas that people had about what might be driving the growth of ghost dwellings in different places. And I really converged on 6 that I thought that I could loosely test, like you said, and with a sort of neighborhood scale data kind of within particular metros. And so the first one, I would call it, really it's just gentrification, the idea that you're going to find a lot of ghost dwellings in particular neighborhoods where median income is going up and usually fast. And then the second one is related to that, but more of a static rather than a rate of change. And I call that one elite enclaves. So the idea being that people who are going to buy ghost dwellings like to be in, elite areas in different ways. And one the crude way that I operationalized that was neighborhoods that have an unusually high number of white people for the metro area that they are in. And then the third one was just the retirement idea, or the snowbird or retirement idea. So areas that just have large concentrations of elderly 65 plus people.
Yeah.
The fourth I called amenity landscapes. Lots of retail, basically, which I proxied for as lots of retail jobs within the census tract.
Okay.
The fifth one, this one's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's called the compensation hypothesis. And it came from some Spanish researchers. And their idea was that picture very dense Spanish cities, maybe you live in a small apartment right in the center of the city in a very dense area. You might have a greater desire to have a weekend home, which you go to on the weekends. It's too far to commute from every day. So you use it as a weekend home rather than as where you live all the time. And maybe that is your primary residence. And then, you have this second home in the city.
Okay. Yeah.
And then, and I proxied for that by lots of density within the neighborhood, an unusual amount of population density or housing unit density within the neighborhood. And then the last one is also a little bit of a mouthful, but I called it market formation. And this comes from some of the financialization literature. Some researchers have written about how the kind of creative destruction that we've had from things like the Great Recession, which led to a foreclosure crisis, and the stock of foreclosed homes that were kind of easy pickings for investors to sort of snatch up. And that was sort of the clay from which this new asset class, single family rentals owned by institutional investors, kind of was formed. And the idea here would be, maybe places where there were a lot of foreclosures and where the market was slow to recover, maybe those would be places where investors would swoop in and buy lots of second homes. And then just to kind of cut to the chase, the ones for which I found support, and I should say that, in some of these I found support in some areas and not in others. So I don't want to universalize anything. I think there are probably a lot of different dynamics going on here, but I found pretty strong support for the elite enclave one. So unusually white neighborhoods seemed to be, correlated with larger numbers of ghost dwellings. I found strong support for the retirement explanation in 5 of the cities, Las Vegas, Miami, New Orleans, New York City, San Francisco. And I would just point out that, 4 of those 5 have, pretty mild winters, which you would imagine might be attractive to a lot of retirees with a lot of money. The one that has to do with retail, I found modest support for that one in most of the cities. And then the others, I didn't really find a whole lot of support for. And you already said this, Shane, but I just want to reiterate, these are real loose tests here. I'm not claiming that I'm, finding the one and the true reason for why ghost dwellings appear where they do. This is just more in the spirit of exploration, with these sorts of correlations.
Yeah, I think it's a good starting point. And I mean, I think what you just said about there's just a lot of variation, and I'm not sure that there is one explanation for what's going on here. It's just different places have different contexts. And I think we'll talk about this here in the next question I have. So you found that ghost dwellings are highly concentrated. That's another feature here within a pretty small number of neighborhoods within a city, but that the types of neighborhoods look very different from city to city. So this seems to be a pretty common theme. There isn't just one model for a city or neighborhood with relatively high shares of ghost dwellings. That local context seems to really matter. So whereas ghost dwellings in Miami might be concentrated in high-rise towers near the beach, and many of them owned maybe by expatriates from Latin America or the Caribbean, ghost dwellings in Atlanta might be concentrated in kind of a posh suburban single-family neighborhood with very different ownership profile. So what else should we know about where ghost dwellings are found and concentrated? Because this concentration seems like a really important factor as well.
Yeah, well, I think you really covered it there, Shane. I think takeaway number one is that they're intensely concentrated. And one way that I measured that is what percentage of the county's population lives in census tracts that contain 75% of all the ghost dwellings within that county. And in Miami-Dade County, which was the most concentrated of the 7 that I looked at, it was 8%. Wow. So just to say that again, 3/4 of the ghost dwellings are within census tracts that only 8% of Miami-Dade residents live in. So that's very concentrated. And then I think the least concentrated was San Francisco. And even that was, 1/4 of the population of San Francisco lives in census tracts that contain 3/4 of the ghost dwellings. So yeah, the concentration, that's the first thing that I would say. And then the second thing that I would say is, if you know a city that has a lot of ghost dwellings and you're familiar with it, and you kind of think about what kinds of places you would imagine them being in, chances are those are the places where they are.
Right.
The places that you would imagine are attractive to people from the outside, right? So like you said, in Miami, there's a lot in Miami Beach. Now, that's not in the city of Miami, but for this analysis, I was looking at the whole county. There's a lot in downtown Miami, which is not by the beach, but is a downtown and has lots of high-rise housing. There's also a lot, and this is maybe less expected, at least to people who don't know Miami, but there's a suburb called Doral, which is close to the airport and is known as a big hub of the Venezuelan immigrant and expat and maybe partially resident community. In Austin, it's the downtown. So where I live, it's intensely concentrated in the downtown. And just, the Airbnb belt of Austin extends a lot further away from where the ghost dwellings are located. But in Austin, really, the ghost dwellings are, very tightly packed within, the city's CBD. So yeah, like you said, it's different from city to city.
For the sort of last part of the analysis, you're looking at building level data. So different buildings that share certain characteristics across or within a city, but across the city. And so you were looking at things like condo ownership structure, single unit dwellings versus multifamily, if it's more concentrated among housing built before 1950 or in housing over 6 stories tall. What did you find in that part of the analysis?
Yeah, and I should just preface this by making a little bit of a wonky point, but it's an important point for this analysis, which is that I was relying on micro data, which is sampled data. And, when you're looking at ghost dwellings, you're looking at a subset of a subset, right? So you're getting down to a pretty tiny slice of the housing market. So as a result, when you analyze data that way, you get these pretty large error bars, right? So things have to be pretty different for you to say, I'm statistically quite confident that there's a real there with the pattern. So
you're starting with a city with 300,000 homes maybe, and it's only 1% of those are ghost dwellings of any kind. And then you're looking, only the ghost dwellings that are built before 1950, for example. Yeah. It's getting pretty narrow.
If you don't look at the error bars, then you run the risk of finding some specious trends that are really just noise. So, when you kind of look at the error bars, I only found a few kind of cases where ghost dwelling building characteristics seem to significantly differ from the housing stock as a whole. But, the ones that I found, at least some of them, I think probably fit with what you would expect. So, for example, in Las Vegas and especially in Miami and New York, ghost dwellings are significantly more likely to be in tall buildings, which I define as taller than 6 stories than the housing stock as a whole. And then also, regarding condos, more ghost dwellings are in condos than is the case for the overall housing stock in Las Vegas, Miami, and New York. And so again, I think a lot of people would expect that.
Yeah, I mean, given the error bars, given how small this sample is. It's kind of surprising you found any significant results here.
It was perhaps a somewhat marginal analysis, but it turned up those patterns, which confirm, I think, a lot of what a lot of us would suspect.
Yeah, and I want to talk about condos a little more here. So I think in a way, condos make sense as ghost dwellings, in part because you always have someone watching over them for you. You have like a property manager or whoever, and most of the upkeep is also taken care of by the HOA. You do still have to take care of the inside of a unit yourself, though you could probably hire someone for it. But that's really where regular upkeep is probably most or probably least important, especially if you're not living there very often. On the other hand, HOA fees can be really large, and Miami is actually especially surprising in some ways because homeowners insurance there is really high too. It's about 1% of the property's value each year just in insurance costs. So, you have HOA fees, you have taxes, you have insurance. These should all be deterrents in some way to long-term vacancy because, unlike what you're paying for your mortgage, which is helping build wealth, these other things are just kind of money down the drain. Can you talk a little bit more about condo ownership, just generally, what role it plays? I'm thinking about this. A concern I have, I guess, is in the US, we have almost a nationwide problem. Miami is unique in this regard that it builds a lot of condos, but almost everywhere else, most new multifamily housing is rentals, and very few condos are being built. And so it worries me if people see condos as these like safe boxes in the sky that no one actually lives in, and they're just being built for oligarchs and so forth.
Yeah. As I was reflecting further on this paper in the last few days to kind of get ready for this interview, I was thinking, why has this issue arguably been more prominent, in some places outside the US than in the US? And I think some of it, Shane, goes back to what you were saying that, in the recent last 10, 15 years, a big share of new multifamily housing in the United States has been rental rather than ownership. And if you go to some other countries, that's completely the opposite. And, I think it was the Sightline Institute has contrasted Vancouver and Seattle, which are, pretty similar places, pretty close to each other, maybe not entirely similar economies, but have some similarities in their economies. And yet in Seattle, it's all rentals all the time in terms of what's being built. And there's actually, some people are worried that there aren't enough condos to provide home ownership opportunities for people who would like to stay in the city, but would like to buy something that's not a million plus single family house. And in Vancouver, it's almost the opposite problem, where practically nothing but condos gets built unless it's subsidized. And in fact, government policy tries to intervene to build what they call more purpose-built rentals. They actually have that term. And we don't have that term in the United States because it's not a problem. The market, produces purpose-built rentals, all day long. So I think maybe the ghost dwellings conversation would loom larger in this country if more condos were being built. But with that being said, when they do get built, often I've noticed condos are kind of castigated as, oh, well, those are just condos. There's sort of a whiff of them being luxury housing. But, as you and your listeners know very well, in a lot of hot market cities, it's single family houses that are the real luxury housing. And, condos might be some of the few, lower priced ownership options that are around. So I think it would be a big problem if condos get sort of tarred with this brush, with this ghost dwelling brush.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of why we produce so much rental housing versus condos, I think we should do an episode on that in the future, actually. And I think there's a lot of reasons. You hear a lot about like construction warranty or construction defect insurance, this kind of thing. But it does seem, based on our conversation with Jiro Yoshida last month on Japanese housing policy, it seems like the tax incentives and these other things play a really big role as well.
I mean, I think it's such an interesting paper to me, and I think it's such a challenging thing to study. And one reason for that is just because the determinants of a ghost dwelling or a concentration of ghost dwellings almost by definition, don't show up where you're looking at the dwelling itself. right? Like the fact that these are concentrated means that census data, as they become more concentrated, becomes less useful because a greater proportion of the housing units in that area are just owned by people who don't live there, right? And so you can examine one of these neighborhoods for median income or demographics, but if it's 40% ghost dwellings, the census is actually not telling you very much. And that's a huge obstacle to studying this. And a very formative experience of mine is that I used to live, my first job out of college, I was a newspaper reporter on Nantucket Island, which is mostly ghost dwellings. It's 70%, according to the census, of vacant and seasonal use. And so one of the most startling things about it is that the census tells you very little about Nantucket, right? And Nantucket is, according to the census, and it's true for 8 months of the year, a sort of mid to low income working class community of about 8,000 people. It's probably more like 11 now, but this was a long time ago when I was there. But it's actually, if you go there in July, full of billionaires, right? And the determinants of when people buy ghost dwellings in Nantucket have nothing to do, to a great extent, with what's happening on Nantucket. They have things they have to do with what's happening on Wall Street. And I think, the Jake has said this a couple of times, but I really want to emphasize it, that a lot of what's going on is quite prosaic, in the sense of there's really only so many Russian oligarchs in the world. We can probably all agree there's too many, right? But like not enough to explain this. But the fact is that baby boomers who did all right, and that's not necessarily the majority of them, but it's a non-trivial minority, and there's a lot of them. In the last 10 or 15 years, the combination of their accumulated savings and a dynamic of economic growth that has been unequal has left them with a lot of money. And so it's not outlandish that, their retirement advisor says to them, you've got plenty of money in bonds and stocks. Is there a place you can buy do you want to buy a place near your kids? Do you want to? And so I'm not terribly surprised to see Austin on the list. It's surprising, I agree, but it's the capital of a geographically vast state. And if you have to go to the capital on a regular basis and you have a bunch of money and you work in some sort of government consulting, which has become much more lucrative in the last 20 years, well, maybe you don't want to do a hotel all the time. Maybe you just snap up a condo or a house. And the other place I've lived where the census tells you virtually nothing about it is Ithaca, New York, which is a college town. When I worked at Cornell. And the story there is sort of it's a way of looking at this kind of in reverse. The old timers at Cornell would always tell us, a newer faculty, that Cornell thrived when New York was a bit of a basket case, because faculty wanted to avoid the urban crisis and have a nice house in a college town. But while I was there, the faculty who were sort of progressing toward retirement and doing well in departments that paid better than city planning, they were buying pied-à-terres in New York. And these are guys who, and women, although they were mostly guys, there was a certain generation of professor. Yeah, they were quite well off, but they weren't billionaires, right? They were just people who had a good paying job for a long time, and they were reaching sort of 3/4 of the way into their career, and they just had extra money, and now New York's a nice place, right? And they just bought a house there. And I really do think that, explains a lot of what's going on, right? It's just like people have always had vacation homes, but now a small segment of people have much more money.
Yeah, and they're not people that you can easily cast as villains, I don't think. And just as one more example that I have a close friend who their parents, the mom worked part-time most of her career. The dad is an engineer. I don't know what they make. Maybe they're still working in their late 50s, early 60s, making probably $150,000 a year, $200,000 a year, and have made decent money all their lives. They own a home up in Los Angeles that they raised their children in, but now they live in San Diego, but they still have that home in Los Angeles, and they just visit it on weekends sometimes. It's worth at least $1 million, but why sell it? Especially with Prop 13, they're paying such low taxes on it, that they just see more benefit from keeping it than getting rid of it. And I would prefer that people like that just sell their homes, but it's not an oligarch. It is very prosaic in that way.
And I guess the one last thing I'd say, back to this sort of the villain thing is, even if they sold it, the demand is there clearly for people to sometimes keep an empty house in these places. And so they probably sell it to someone who did the same thing, right? I think there's places where this was a huge issue on Nantucket, right? Where it's not a very big place, and of course it's 30 miles out to sea, right? It was hard to get your labor force to Nantucket if they didn't live there. And so the fact that 70% of the housing was reserved for seasonal use sort of manifested as a real pinch for people who lived there. But it at the and this is going to play out less extent in New York or San Francisco. But it wasn't the kind of thing where you could say, well, I wish these people wouldn't do that, right? Because it was the whole economy.
Yeah.
And so I think it's sort of, we've talked about this a lot on this show, that a lot of these conversations start to, if you follow them down a particular path enough, they just start to implicitly embrace this mindset of scarcity. Like, we're only going to have so many housing units. And so if someone buys one and keeps it empty, they have sort of struck a blow at us in this zero-sum way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more defensible if you live on a small island that's mostly conservation land and you're out to sea, and almost all of your selling point is this idea that it's not crowded. But if you're in New York City, like, the obvious solution to this is just to build some more housing. And if rich people want to buy some and keep it empty, like, well, God love them. I mean, it's not because that's a great thing to do. I mean, I'm not going to lose any sleep for these folks, but how do you stop them, really?
Yeah, and we will get to, I think, one or two possibilities for that. I did want to add one more data point that, is not the focus of your paper, but I think is really important, which is that even as the national share of ghost dwellings has increased from 0.7 to 1.4% over this 20-year period, overall vacancies are pretty stable over that time. I looked it up. It's about 12% in both in 2000 and 2017, or around then. And vacancies in big cities are actually at historic lows. So even with the increase in ghost dwellings accounting for that. So I'll put aside COVID impacts, so using numbers that were a little earlier, but just for a few examples, Los Angeles' vacancy rate for all of 2019, or 2005 and 2019. So Los Angeles went from 4.4 to 4.0%, so a slight decrease. New York went from 5.1% to 4.3%. San Francisco went from 8% to 3.8%. Seattle, which has probably built more housing per capita than any coastal city in the US over the past decade, actually dropped from 7% to 4.4%. Even Houston, which always builds a ton of housing and has a much higher kind of natural vacancy rate, or just consistent vacancy rate, went from 15% to 11.4% over that period. Other cities saw similar trends. So, with all of that in mind, what do you make of that, of this recent emphasis? Or maybe we can just talk about how vacancies overall have shifted. We've talked about this enough. I'll show my cards here and just say, I think residential vacancies overall are, I think, at best like a tertiary problem compared to all the other barriers to housing production and housing stability. But I also see benefits to like taxing or otherwise discouraging these kinds of things. So just want to kind of open this up for discussion about like what's going on here and these different countervailing trends.
Well, I mean, my take is pretty similar to what you were just outlining there, Shane. But we could get into what might be a couple of policy responses if in fact we even think one is needed. But yeah, just back to the scarcity mindset that Mike brought up. I mean, if in a way, if you're worried that people are buying housing units as a speculative investment because they think they're going to make so much money by investing in that housing unit, that it'll be a good investment for them, even though, they're not renting it out and barely living in it for a period of many years, the best way to stick it to them would be to make their investment less valuable by building more housing, right?
Right.
I'm just really agreeing with what you were kind of both hinting at. But should we get into a couple of policy ideas?
Yeah. I think you mentioned near the end of your paper, I think, or at some point in there, that several years ago, there was a 15% transaction tax imposed on foreign real estate buyers in Vancouver, Toronto, and Sydney. What was the effect of that? I have a just fundamental concern that there's a xenophobic element to this. And it's also just, relatively untargeted. But beyond that, my understanding was that it was really only, it caused maybe a temporary dip in prices and then they just kind of surged right back. Do you know what the experience was with that approach?
I haven't looked deeply into it, but I did just read up a little bit on what's been happening in the Vancouver region. So we could just dig into that a little bit.
Sure.
So the province of British Columbia adopted a vacancy tax about 3 years ago, and it applies only in 4 areas: Greater Vancouver, Victoria, Nanaimo, which is a beautiful area of Vancouver Island, and then Kelowna, which is a kind of interior resort area. And under that tax, foreign owners pay a higher rate. So there's a vacancy tax across the board, but there is this element that you could view as xenophobic, where foreign owners pay a still higher rate.
I feel like when it's specifically tied to vacancy, it doesn't bother me quite as much. I think there's also like a 15% tax on just any kind of foreign purchase, even if they're going to live in the unit full time.
Well, so it's confusing because, and obviously the Canadian federal system and authority over levying taxes is totally different from ours here in the US, but the city at this exact same time, concurrently with the province, the city of Vancouver added its own vacancy tax plus a foreign buyer's tax at the same time. And, a report just came out, and, the BC Ministry of Finance was, their claim was that the provincial tax was a success. And their evidence for that was that 18,000 rental units within Greater Vancouver over those 3 years had been added back to the long-term rental market as a result. And, again, that's a big issue of public concern there, just not enough, as they call them, purpose-built rental housing units. But, but there seems to be a real lack of consensus among people who follow that market closely. Was this because of these taxes, or was it because of other factors? COVID has probably, dampened some of the demand to, buy a pied-à-terre that you can't really go visit if you live overseas, right? Or, even traveling within Canada during COVID was extremely difficult. Like for long periods, you couldn't really go to other cities, at least not without skirting some rules. So it's hard to know exactly what's going on. I wouldn't say there's a real clear story about exactly what these taxes do or don't do.
Yeah. And I found myself occupying this weird space where I'm like very skeptical of people who are saying vacancies are a big problem, but also totally fine with a vacancy tax. Like partly just to like have people shut up and like move on to something more important. Although I'm not sure it actually accomplishes that, but also just like, yeah, vacancies, I would rather not have them, and it would raise some revenue. I looked
$1 million Canadian to the
province. Yeah. And for
which is some money. It's not, I wouldn't call that an earth-shattering amount of money.
Well, in Vancouver, I think this is just the city. I looked at a 2018 report. I'm sure they have more recent ones, but the number of vacancies from 2017 to 2018, units that were reported vacant, dropped by something like 500 units in that year, which the city has like 300,000 units, so it wasn't a huge number, but like, so be it, that's fine. But it also did raise like $40 million. And I think an important thing to note in all of this is that the average value of the units that were reported long-term vacant for condos was 1.4 million. It's already very high. For single-family homes, which were about a quarter of the vacant units, it was 3.4 million. And so there's this part of it where even if these go back on the market, they are very expensive housing. And it's still, it's better to have them occupied long-term than not. But on the other hand, they're paying a tax of, I think it's about 1% of the value. So like that single family home is paying $34,000 to remain vacant. And I kind of feel like we could do more with that money than you would, the benefit you could get out of spending that money on rental assistance or subsidizing construction, because that's every year. Far exceeds the benefit you're getting from actually, somehow forcing that unit to be reoccupied by a rich household.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like the good news, to return to my empirical results for a moment, was, since I didn't really, and again, I'm not, this was a loose analysis, but I didn't really find any support for the idea that ghost dwellings are, tied to gentrification or to rapid increases in income within a neighborhood. And I mean, that makes sense to me. Like, I would imagine most people who are buying ghost dwellings, they have a lot of money, they are buying in some city that they don't live in. They're probably not going to be the risk-taking gentrifiers who are going to take a chance on some on the edge neighborhood, right? So
they're the type who when they visit, they just want everything taken care of for them. They don't want to deal with fixing things up or worrying about security when they're gone, that kind of stuff.
That's my sense. And, I haven't done qualitative research, so I don't want to get out over my skis and make claims about things that I haven't properly looked at. But I mean, that makes sense to me, right? That would be the case. And so if that is the case, then I mean, a lot of this is probably just a case of very affluent neighborhoods, having even more upward pressure put on their markets because of, ghost dwelling buyers wanting to buy units there. And maybe there are ways to harness that for the good. And, a vacancy tax, sure, maybe that's a way to do it. Another way to do it might be, and, inclusionary zoning is a whole other, vast topic, but, maybe if you are trying to tailor your inclusionary zoning to where it's most effective, maybe you get more aggressive in areas where there's a lot of ghost dwellings because there's a lot of value to be captured and maybe a lot of people buying condos who are not terribly price sensitive. And then you either bake in some affordability, right in that area, or you generate a lot of in lieu fees, which can be used for affordable housing in the city.
Is that assuming that the ghost dwellings are being built from the ground up?
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be, right? Because obviously include that you're only capturing a slice of new housing that gets.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty there is this: you rebound back on this idea that the proper target of intervention is people who build housing. And that's not most ghost dwellings, right? I mean, it's just the most visible is the new tower that goes up and you suspect it's empty. But, there's just walk down some streets in Manhattan and there's some sprinkled throughout those buildings, which were built in the 1930s and 1920s are some ghost dwellings.
Yeah.
And you let that off the hook if it's something you're concerned about. I mean, I think, with respect to a vacancy tax, you always think when you think about a tax, you're like, well, there's always this twin purpose. You can raise revenue or you can get a behavior change.
Right.
And it seems to me, as you guys have said, that the tax rate for a vacancy tax to actually push it into a different purpose in the market would have to be extremely high. You already have all the evidence, as Jake has mentioned, of a very low elasticity of demand with respect to price. You have people who are buying a very expensive asset and paying taxes and fees on it every year, even though they probably aren't going to use it, which is, strongly suspects that adding another, kind of incremental fee is going to get you money, and that's good.
It's kind of free money in that sense.
Yeah, it isn't going to free up the house. And then, as Shane points out, that even if you do free up the house, you have freed up an expensive housing unit. And that's, again, better than nothing, but not going to do what I think some people think it will, is sort of, find a reliable shelter for a precariously housed person. So in that respect, my sense on vacancy taxes is probably similar to your guys, which is they're harmless enough. They're progressive, right? In the sense that these tend to be taxes that fall on high value properties that are owned by high income people. And they probably don't have a lot of excess burden because for those reasons, the people just write the check. And honestly, I do think when we study this, we can, a big city is different from a vacation place, but we can learn from vacation places because they're the ones who've contended with ghost dwellings for the longest time and where the ghost dwellings are most prevalent. And one undeniable advantage of all the ghost dwellings on Nantucket for all the problems they caused was that they were just a runway to tax exporting, right? That like huge amounts of Nantucket's public services were just financed by people who not only didn't live there, but couldn't vote.
And don't use the services.
And don't use most of the services.
Your children don't go to the schools.
Yeah, it's and that's, obviously that's an exceptional case. 70% of the housing is empty. Right. But at the same time, one way to think about a vacancy tax is to just think about, from a public choice angle, well, here's a runway to tax exporting. If you want, to soak the rich, here's a simple place to start. And, you just have to keep in mind, it probably doesn't do that much for your housing problem. But if you just need money,
right?
Well, here's as good a place as any to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're one of the few places in the world that is desirable enough that people want to have a ghost dwelling in your city, like, take advantage.
It could be like the housing equivalent of the taxes on rental cars, or hotel taxes, right? It's
exactly.
To
hotel tax is a very good analogy. I do want to note that there's a lot of embodied energy in building a home, and so building a home just to keep it vacant when we're facing climate change, there is an issue there, and I don't want to totally dismiss that. I still suspect that a 6,000 square foot penthouse that throws off $50,000 a year in taxes to the city, or just fees on a vacancy tax, might still be more good than bad. But I do want to acknowledge that.
Well, I think that's exactly right, and I think that can be addressed with, cities do have the ability to at least strongly encourage covenants that say, if you're going to build in this neighborhood, we want people living here. I think they're difficult to enforce, but you can make that clear. But I just, I'll rejoin. I totally agree with what you said, but the rejoinder here, just so we don't create any misinterpretations, is anyone who's been to New Orleans knows that there's not much new housing there, right? These ghost dwellings are old. And again, even in New York City, the super talls are very evident, but there just aren't that many of them. Rich people buy existing buildings and keep them empty if they just want to have a place to go.
Yeah. Well, my last vacancy related question it actually relates to, you use this phrase in the paper, vacancy amidst prosperity, to describe ghost dwellings. And it reminded me of the Henry George concept of poverty amidst progress. So we'll make the obligatory note here that yes, a land value tax would solve this. But it also made me think about the role of property taxes in all of this. And, I kind of talked about this with the Miami example, but the lower the property taxes someone is paying, the lower the costs of leaving that home unoccupied and sort of speculating on future appreciation, assuming that's what someone is doing, which is probably not always the case. I always point to Vancouver here. We've been using it a lot as an example because it's one of the most expensive cities in North America. But I think more importantly, it also has probably the lowest property tax rate. It's under 0.3%. California's property tax rate is about 1.1%. The US average is in the ballpark of 1.5%. And there are many states that have taxes more around 2% a year, often places that rely less on income taxes. So even though it's not in the paper, did you make any attempts to look at how variation in property taxes affects ghost dwelling concentration or frequency? And I know Mike had a question also about tourism and if that plays any role.
No, I did not. I did not look at that. I would just point out that one of my, 7 big city ghost dwelling, capitals, if you will, Austin, is a city that has some of the highest property taxes of any big city in the U.S. I think.
Yeah.
Roughly 2.1 or 2.2%, depending on exactly where you are in the city.
It's really hard to do a cross-city comparison like that because the effective property tax rate is a mess to actually make in a cross-sectional way. You would I think it's probably true that a higher property tax rate would deter some of this, but again, you're just not talking about price-sensitive people.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is the big issue, and so you would be pushing for property tax rates that to the American eye would probably look confiscatory if you really wanted to change these uses.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Jake, is there anything important we missed that you want to cover? And whether yes or no, after responding to that, you can tell us what else you're up to.
Okay. This is, I think we covered a lot of ground. Just one thing I just wanted to mention, just as a curiosity, something I learned about just in the last couple of years is this phenomenon of game day houses. Have you, either of you, heard of those?
I haven't heard the phrase, but I know the concept, I think.
Yeah. So for the listeners who don't live in Texas or who aren't college football fans, there's this phenomenon, and you could find it in College Station or in Tuscaloosa, but maybe also in large cities too. Maybe it's happening in Austin for all I know. But just people will buy a house that's located close to the football stadium for the big, for football season. And then you can get there the night before. You don't have to deal with the traffic morass on your way there. You can have a good time and, drink lots of margaritas or whatever you're going to do, and then walk over to the game afterwards. And I think that's just a good reminder that there are these complicated, and evolving consumption patterns that are, behind a lot of this sort of thing, in addition to all the things that we talked about, like speculative investment and so forth. So I just think there's a lot going on here. There's a lot to unpack, and, like you said, this paper is just exploratory and is just sort of like a first cut at what's going on here.
I think, it's a great point bringing up the game day stuff. And I think it reinforces what we talked about earlier about how prosaic some of this is, and just the idea that there's a segment of our population that just has a lot more money now because, 30 years ago, if you were a big Notre Dame fan, you'd come to town for the game, but you'd find a hotel room in South Bend. But you're a Notre Dame graduate and you've been in the law firm for 20 years and you're a well-off guy, but you're no one's idea of a billionaire, but you can buy a house there. And you do, and it's not necessarily an investment. It's a reflection of the fact that you have a lot of money and you really like Notre Dame football.
It's really a luxury in like the purest
form.
Yeah.
And so I do think a lot of things we see in the housing market that we get upset about because they are upsetting are symptoms of this tremendous inequality that we've seen develop. And I think the game day houses are just a great example of that. Like, my goodness, it's just when I was growing up, it would be unheard of that someone would buy a house just so, 10 days a year they could go watch a football game. Yeah. But people do that now.
Any hints on things you're working on coming up?
Things I'm working on. Yeah, I am lucky.
We promise not to scoop you.
Yeah, no, I'm lucky to have a semester on leave right now, and so I'm trying to make hay while the sun shines and get embarked on a book project. And my book project is going to be all to do with. I'm not going to say that the debate over single-family zoning has been, won by those of us like, all three of us who think that it should be undone. I don't want to say that. But the book is really more about what are some of the different things that you could replace single-family zoning with after you repeal it. Mm-hmm. Because I think, again, it's not that there's consensus on this, but it is starting to happen really fast in a lot of different places. To an extent that I would not have believed even 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, we're ready for that conversation of now what?
Now what? Because there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of different directions and there's some really different visions. And I think you can catch glimpses of them in different places. And so that's what the book is intended to be about. So I'm going to be working on that for a good while now.
That sounds great.
Well, we'll look forward to that. Professor Jake Wegmann, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
That is it for this one. You can read more about Professor Wegmann's research and find our show notes and a transcript of the interview at our website, lewis.ucla.edu. The UCLA Lewis Center is on Facebook and Twitter. I am on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips, and Mike is there at MichaelManville6. If you've been enjoying the show, please be sure to share it with your friends and colleagues, and let us know what you think. We love to hear from listeners. Thank you for listening, thanks for subscribing, and we'll see you next time.